In the pre-dawn darkness of June 11th, 1988, two massive Chinook helicopters thundered across the Sahara Desert, their rotor blades cutting through air that would soon shimmer with killing heat. Inside the lead aircraft, pilots squinted through night vision goggles, watching the endless expanse of sand unfold beneath them like an alien landscape painted in shades of green. They were 500 miles from their starting point in southern Chad, 500 miles from safety, and they were flying into one of the most audacious theft operations of the Cold War. Their target wasn't gold or diamonds or state secrets locked in a vault. No, what waited for them at an abandoned airbase in the middle of nowhere was something far more valuable to American military intelligence, a Soviet attack helicopter that had struck terror into the hearts of Afghan mujahideen, a machine that represented the cutting edge of Soviet military aviation, a weapon that had changed the calculus of modern warfare. The Americans wanted it. They wanted to take it apart, study it, understand it, and they were willing to risk an international incident to get their hands on it. This is the story of Operation Mount Hope III, the night the Night Stalkers stole one of the Soviet Union's most prized possessions right out from under Muammar Gaddafi's nose. The flying tank. To understand why the United States was willing to mount such a risky operation, you need to understand what made the MiL-MY-24 Hind so special. When Soviet pilots first climbed into the cockpit of this beast in 1972, they knew they were flying something different, something that would change the nature of aerial combat forever. They called it the flying tank, and the nickname wasn't just military bravado. The Mi-24 was genuinely armored like a tank, with titanium plating protecting the crew compartment and ballistic-resistant windscreens that could withstand heavy machine gun fire. The fuselage could take hits from 12.7mm rounds from any angle. Even the rotor blades were made of titanium, capable of continuing to function even after taking battle damage that would have brought down any Western helicopter. But the Hind wasn't just tough, it was fast, brutally fast for a helicopter of its size. The official world speed record still held by a Hind variant stands at 332 kilometers per hour or 206 miles per hour. That's faster than most cars on a highway, and this thing was doing it while loaded down with weapons and armor. The speed came from two massive Isotov turboshaft engines, each pumping out 2,200 horsepower, driving a 5-bladed main rotor that could lift this 12-ton monster into the sky and send it screaming across the battlefield. What really set the Hind apart, though, was its versatility. While American helicopters were specialized, either gunships like the Cobra or transport birds like the Huey, the Soviets had created something that could do both jobs at once. The Mi-24 could carry 8 fully equipped combat troops or 12 lightly equipped soldiers in its passenger compartment, while simultaneously bringing massive firepower to bear with its nose-mounted machine gun and wing-mounted rockets and missiles. It was as if someone had taken an Apache gunship and a Black Hawk transport and welded them together into a single, terrifying machine. The weapons loadout was staggering. A 4-barrel Yak-B 12.7mm machine gun in a chin turret capable of spitting out 4,000 rounds per minute. Pylons on the stub wings could carry a deadly mix of 57mm rocket pods, anti-tank guided missiles like the AT-6 Spiral, and even conventional bombs. The Hind could engage tanks, fortified positions, other helicopters, and ground troops with equal effectiveness. Soviet doctrine called for them to fly in pairs or larger formations, providing mutual support and overwhelming firepower that could devastate an entire battlefield in minutes. The export version, designated MY-25, was what Libya and other Soviet client states received. While slightly downgraded from the versions flown by Soviet forces, the MY-25 was still a formidable machine, representing some of the most advanced military helicopter technology available anywhere in the world during the 1980s. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen gave it a name that perfectly captured their fear and respect: the Devil's Chariot. They had good reason to fear it. The Hind could appear without warning, unleash devastating fire, and disappear before effective countermeasures could be brought to bear. A thaw in the ice. 1987 and 88 were strange years in the Cold War. On the surface, things were changing faster than anyone had thought possible. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had taken power in the Soviet Union in March of 1985, was pushing reforms that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Perestroika, glasnost, these weren't just buzzwords, they represented a fundamental shift in how the Soviet Union operated. And perhaps most remarkably, Gorbachev had found an unlikely partner in Ronald Reagan, the same American president who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire just a few years before. In December of 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev had signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Washington, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was the first time the superpowers had agreed to actually reduce their nuclear arsenals rather than just limit their growth. The treaty negotiations had been intense, sometimes contentious, but both leaders seemed genuinely committed to stepping back from the nuclear brink. They met again in Moscow in May and June of 1988, working on further arms control agreements. When a reporter asked Reagan during that Moscow visit if he still considered the Soviet Union an evil empire, the president simply replied, "No, that was another time, another era." But beneath the smiles and handshakes and treaty signings, the Cold War's fundamental realities hadn't changed overnight. The Soviet Union still had massive conventional forces arrayed across Eastern Europe. Both sides still maintained thousands of nuclear warheads on hair-trigger alert. And perhaps most importantly, neither side fully trusted the other. The thaw in relations was real, but it was fragile, and both militaries continued to prepare for potential conflict. Intelligence gathering didn't stop just because the leaders were talking. If anything, it became more important than ever to understand what the other side was capable of. This is where the Hind fit into the bigger picture. Western intelligence had been trying to get their hands on an intact Mi-24 or Mi-25 for years. They'd seen it in action in Afghanistan, where CIA-supplied Stinger missiles had finally given the Mujahideen an effective weapon against Soviet helicopter gunships. They'd seen it in various conflicts around the world, where Soviet client states deployed the aircraft. But seeing something in combat and actually having one to take apart and study were two very different things. American military planners wanted to know everything about the Hind, its avionics, its armor composition, its engine performance characteristics, its vulnerabilities. They wanted to train American pilots against it, to develop tactics and countermeasures, and they wanted to compare it directly to American helicopters like the Apache, which was just entering service. So while Reagan and Gorbachev were working to reduce tensions, the CIA and the Pentagon were still very much interested in obtaining Soviet military technology. The trick was doing it in a way that wouldn't blow up the fragile détente that was developing. They couldn't exactly steal a Hind directly from a Soviet base. But if one happened to be abandoned in a third country, left behind in the chaos of war, well, that was a different story entirely. Desert warfare, the Toyota War. To understand how an advanced Soviet helicopter ended up abandoned in the middle of the Chadian desert, we need to talk about one of the strangest and most one-sided conflicts of the 1980s, the Toyota War. The name alone tells you this wasn't a conventional conflict. This was a war where pickup trucks armed with machine guns and anti-tank missiles proved more effective than Soviet T-55 tanks, where mobility and knowledge of terrain trumped firepower and armor. The roots of the conflict stretched back to Libya's ambitions in northern Chad, specifically a barren strip of land called the Ozu Strip. Muammar Gaddafi, Libya's colorful and unpredictable dictator, claimed this territory based on a colonial-era treaty that had never been properly ratified. But Gaddafi's interest wasn't just about historical claims or lines on a map. He envisioned a greater Libya, perhaps even a pan-African Arab state, and the Ozu Strip was key to these grandiose plans. There were also rumors of uranium deposits in the region, though these were never confirmed. By 1987, Libya had invested heavily in its Chadian adventure. Gaddafi had sent thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, dozens of combat aircraft, and a full complement of Soviet-made military hardware, including those feared Mi-24 and Mi-25 Hind helicopters. The Libyan Expeditionary Force numbered somewhere between 8,000 and 11,000 men, equipped with about 300 tanks, multiple rocket launchers, artillery pieces, and extensive air support. On paper, it was an overwhelming force. The Chadian military they faced numbered perhaps 10,000 troops, poorly equipped and operating in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But the Chadians had something the Libyans didn't. They knew the desert, and they had adapted their tactics to take advantage of their knowledge. Armed primarily with Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser pickup trucks, modified to carry heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and French-supplied Milan anti-tank missiles, the Chadian forces under President Hissène Habré had created something like a modern mechanized cavalry. These technicals, as they came to be known, were fast, maneuverable, and perfectly suited to the desert terrain. They could strike hard, move fast, and disappear into the vast Sahara before Libyan forces could respond. The turning point came in early 1987 with a series of devastating Chadian victories. At Fata in January, Chadian forces destroyed a Libyan armored brigade, killing about 800 Libyan soldiers and destroying over 100 tanks. The Chadians lost only 18 men and 3 pickup trucks. It was a stunning demonstration of how the right tactics and mobility could overcome superior firepower. But Fata was just the beginning. The real knockout blow came at Wadi Doum in March of 1987. This was Libya's main airbase in Chad, a massive installation with a nearly 4-kilometer runway built by East German engineers, defended by somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 troops, protected by minefields, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and hundreds of armored vehicles. It was, in theory, impregnable. The Chadians attacked anyway. Using the same tactics that had worked at Fata, they approached at high speed in their Toyotas, discovering that if they drove fast enough over the minefields, the mines often didn't detonate or detonated too late to cause damage. They used their knowledge of the terrain to approach from unexpected directions, catching the defenders off guard. And once they were inside the defenses, the technicals proved devastatingly effective, weaving between Libyan positions, firing their missiles and machine guns, creating chaos and confusion. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it was over, the Libyans had suffered catastrophic losses. At least 1,269 Libyan soldiers were killed, with hundreds more taken prisoner. Over 150 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed or captured. The survivors fled in panic, many running through their own minefields in their haste to escape, suffering even more casualties. The Chadians had won a victory so decisive that it forced Libya to withdraw from most of central and northern Chad. And in their haste to retreat, the Libyans left behind an astonishing amount of equipment, including aircraft at Wadi Doum. The total value of abandoned or destroyed Libyan military equipment was estimated at $1.5 billion. Among the prizes left behind were several Hind helicopters. The prize at Wadi Doum. When Chadian forces took control of the Wadi Doum airbase on March 22, 1987, they found the base littered with abandoned equipment. Libya had tried to destroy some of it with airstrikes, bombing their own base to deny the Chadians the use of the equipment. But they hadn't gotten everything. Among the debris and the destroyed aircraft, the Chadians found at least 2 Mi-25 Hind helicopters that were substantially intact. One had suffered battle damage, including a bullet lodged in its engine. While it might have been flyable, attempting to start it up and fly it out carried too much risk of catastrophic failure mid-flight. The other helicopter was in better condition, though it too had sustained some damage from the chaotic final days at the base. But it was intact enough, valuable enough, that both France and the United States immediately took interest. The French moved first. By January of 1988, they had negotiated with the Chadian government to recover one of the damaged Hinds. It was transported back to France where engineers could study it at their leisure. But the Americans wanted their own helicopter, and they wanted one of the better preserved examples. The negotiations were complex, involving 3 governments: the Chadians, who controlled the territory, the French, who had significant influence in the region, and their own forces on the ground, and the Americans, who were offering the most attractive incentives. The deal that was eventually struck was substantial. The United States would pay Chad $2 million in cash, a significant sum but a bargain for what they were getting. More importantly, they would provide a batch of FIM-92 Stinger missiles, the same shoulder-launched anti-aircraft weapons that had proven so effective against Soviet helicopters in Afghanistan. For Chad, it was an excellent deal: cash, advanced weaponry, and the goodwill of the world's most powerful nation. For the Americans, it was a chance to obtain technology they'd been trying to get for years. But there was a significant problem. The helicopter was sitting in northern Chad at a former Libyan base in territory that was still effectively a war zone. Libyan forces, while badly defeated, were still nearby. Libyan aircraft still flew reconnaissance missions over the area, and Muammar Gaddafi, humiliated by his military's defeat, was looking for any opportunity to strike back at those who had handed him this embarrassment. The Americans couldn't just roll up with a transport plane, load the helicopter, and fly out. They needed a much more sophisticated operation, something that could be executed quickly, quietly, and with minimal risk of detection by Libyan forces who would certainly interfere if they discovered what was happening. For this kind of operation, there was really only one choice. The mission went to the United States Army's most elite helicopter unit, a group of pilots and crew who specialized in exactly these kinds of high-risk, high-reward missions. They were officially designated the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, but everyone knew them by their nickname, the Night Stalkers. America's elite, the Night Stalkers. The formation of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment can be traced directly to one of America's most painful military failures, Operation Eagle Claw, the failed attempt to rescue American hostages held in Iran in April of 1980. That mission had been a disaster, marked by poor coordination between different military branches, inadequate training for the specific mission profile, and ultimately a collision in the Iranian desert that killed 8 American servicemen and destroyed multiple aircraft. In the aftermath, military planners recognized that the United States needed a dedicated Special Operations Aviation Unit, one that specialized in the kind of high-risk, low-visibility missions that conventional units simply weren't equipped to handle. The Army turned to the 101st Airborne Division's aviation group at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. These pilots already had extensive experience with helicopter operations and a reputation for excellence. In the months following Eagle Claw, select pilots and crew from various battalions within the 101st were pulled together and put through intensive training focused on night operations, low-level flying, and operating in hostile territory with minimal support. The initial unit was designated Task Force 158, named after the 158th Aviation Battalion, where many of the original members came from. On October 16, 1981, the task force was officially recognized as a permanent unit and redesignated the 160th Aviation Battalion. Over the following years, as the unit proved its worth in operations from Grenada to the Persian Gulf, it grew and evolved. In May of 1990, it was redesignated as the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the name it still carries today. What set the Night Stalkers apart wasn't just their skills as pilots, though those skills were exceptional. It was their entire approach to operations. They pioneered techniques for flying at extremely low altitudes at night, using early night vision technology that was primitive by today's standards, but revolutionary for its time. They developed specialized navigation techniques for operating in areas with few or no landmarks. They trained relentlessly for missions where a single mistake could mean death, not just for themselves, but for the special operations forces they were often supporting. The unit's motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," wasn't just motivational rhetoric. It was a statement of operational philosophy. Night Stalker missions were planned down to the smallest detail, with contingencies for contingencies. They trained until even the most complex maneuvers became second nature. And when something went wrong, as it inevitably did in high-risk operations, they adapted and overcame rather than aborting. By 1988, the 160th had already proven itself in multiple operations. They'd flown missions in Grenada during Operation Urgent Fury in 1983. They'd been operating in the Persian Gulf during Operation Earnest Will, protecting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers from Iranian attacks. They'd been the first helicopter unit to routinely use night vision goggles and forward-looking infrared systems in combat operations. When the CIA and the Pentagon needed someone to pull off a seemingly impossible helicopter recovery mission in the middle of the Sahara Desert, the Night Stalkers were the obvious choice. For Operation Mount Hope 3, the mission would fall primarily to crews flying the MH-47 Chinook. The Chinook was a workhorse, a tandem-rotor heavy-lift helicopter that had been in service since the Vietnam War. But the MH-47 variant flown by the 160th was heavily modified for special operations. It had extended fuel tanks, giving it much greater range. It had advanced avionics and navigation systems. Most importantly for this mission, it had the raw lifting power needed to carry an Mi-25 Hind as an external slung load. The Hind weighed somewhere between 17 and 18,000 pounds, around 8 tons. It was near the upper limit of what a Chinook could lift, but it was within the realm of possibility. Training in the desert. In April of 1988, as diplomatic negotiations continued with Chad and France, the Night Stalkers began training for what would become Operation Mount Hope 3. The training took place at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, a vast expanse of desert that bore at least some resemblance to the terrain they'd be operating in halfway around the world. White Sands had another claim to fame. It was where the first atomic bomb had been tested in July of 1945, the test that ushered in the nuclear age. Now it would be the proving ground for an operation that, while far less dramatic than the Trinity test, was still highly significant in the ongoing technological competition of the Cold War. The training was exhaustive and methodical. The crews needed to practice every aspect of the mission until they could execute it flawlessly under the worst possible conditions. Night flying was a given. That was the Night Stalkers' bread and butter. But this mission had unique challenges. They'd be flying over 500 miles in a single leg, much of it at low altitude to avoid detection. They'd be operating in extreme heat, with temperatures routinely exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes reaching 110 degrees. The heat affected everything: engine performance, lift capacity, even the ability of the crews to think clearly after hours in a cockpit that felt like an oven. To simulate the weight they'd be carrying, one Chinook was equipped with an external slung load of 6 500-gallon water containers, roughly matching the weight of an Mi-25. The pilots practiced flying with this load, getting a feel for how the helicopter handled when carrying such a massive external weight. It affected everything: the aircraft's speed, its maneuverability, how much fuel it consumed. They needed to know exactly how long they could fly with this load, how much fuel they'd need, where they'd need to refuel. The pilots practiced formation flying at night, maintaining precise positions relative to each other, even when they could barely see. They practiced emergency procedures: what to do if an engine failed, what to do if they came under fire, what to do if weather conditions suddenly deteriorated. They practiced the actual hookup procedure, maneuvering a Chinook into position over a stationary object, attaching the sling load and lifting it smoothly without causing damage. The margin for error was minimal. If the load shifted unexpectedly, it could destabilize the helicopter. If it broke free during flight, it could destroy the Chinook. The mission planners worked out every detail. They determined they would need 2 Chinooks, one to carry the Hind and a second as backup in case of mechanical problems with the first. The backup would also carry additional personnel and any smaller components that needed to be removed from the Hind to reduce its weight. They calculated exactly how much fuel they'd need and where they'd need to refuel. They worked with the Air Force to arrange for a C-130 Hercules transport to serve as a flying gas station, pre-positioning fuel at forward arming and refueling points along the route. French involvement was crucial. France still had troops in Chad as part of Operation Epervier, their long-running military presence in the region. French Mirage F-1 fighter jets would provide top cover, ready to intercept any Libyan aircraft that might stumble onto the operation. French ground forces would help secure the immediate area around Wadi Doum. The French had their own reasons for wanting the operation to succeed. They'd already gotten their own Hind to study, and they wanted to maintain good relations with both Chad and the United States. By mid-May 1988, the training was complete. The crews were as ready as they'd ever be. All that remained was to get the word to go. That word came on May 21st. Operation Mount Hope 3 was authorized. The Night Stalkers loaded their equipment and prepared to deploy halfway around the world to pull off one of the most audacious thefts in military history. Into Africa. On June 10, 1988, a massive United States Air Force C-5 Galaxy cargo plane took off from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, carrying a cargo that would have raised eyebrows if anyone outside the operation had known what was inside. 2 MH-47 Chinook helicopters were loaded in the Galaxy's cavernous cargo hold, along with over 60 personnel including pilots, crew chiefs, maintenance personnel, and a small advanced reconnaissance team. The C-5 was one of the largest aircraft in the world, capable of carrying enormous cargo loads over intercontinental distances. Even so, fitting 2 Chinooks inside required partially disassembling the helicopters and careful loading procedures. The flight to Chad was long, covering thousands of miles and requiring aerial refueling. The C-5 landed at N'Djamena International Airport in southern Chad as dusk was falling. N'Djamena, Chad's capital, was about as far from Wadi Doum as you could get and still be in the same country. The base they were targeting was 550 miles to the north, deep in the Sahara, in what had until recently been Libyan-controlled territory. But N'Djamena was the logical staging point. It had the infrastructure to handle large aircraft, it was securely controlled by the Chadian government, and it was far enough from the border that Libyan reconnaissance aircraft were unlikely to spot the American presence. As soon as the C-5's ramp lowered, ground crews swarmed over the aircraft. The Chinooks had to be reassembled quickly. Night was the best time to work because the temperatures were bearable. During the day, the heat made metal surfaces hot enough to burn unprotected skin. The crews worked through the night, putting the helicopters back together, performing pre-flight checks, loading additional equipment. The Chinooks had been modified for this mission, with extra fuel tanks installed in the cargo area, adding an extra 600 gallons of fuel capacity. Even with this modification, they'd still need to refuel during the mission. An advanced reconnaissance team had already been sent forward days earlier, flown to Wadi Doum in one of the Chinooks to set up security and begin preparing the Hind for transport. This team had a difficult and dangerous job. They were operating in a remote location, with Libyan forces still not that far away. They were exposed, with limited support if something went wrong. But their work was essential. The Hind needed to be partially disassembled to make it light enough and small enough to carry as a slung load. The rotor blades had to come off. Various external components had to be removed. Anything that could reduce weight or drag had to be stripped away while still leaving the core aircraft intact, enough to be valuable for analysis. The advance team also had to establish security and monitoring. They needed to keep watch on nearby Libyan positions, ready to give warning if Libyan forces showed any sign of discovering the operation. The Libyans had been humiliated by their defeat, and if they learned that the Americans were stealing one of their helicopters, they would certainly try to interfere, possibly with airstrikes or even a ground assault. The entire operation depended on speed and stealth, getting in, getting the helicopter, and getting out before anyone knew what was happening. At midnight on June 11th, with everything ready, the 2 Chinooks lifted off from N'Djamena. The second helicopter carried additional personnel and equipment, along with the components that had been removed from the Hind. The plan was for the primary Chinook to arrive at Wadi Doum at dawn, hook up the Hind, and begin the long flight back south. The backup Chinook would handle everything else and provide support if anything went wrong with the primary aircraft. The flight north was tense. The pilots flew low, using the terrain and darkness to avoid detection. Night vision goggles turned the world into an eerie green landscape, but they were essential for flying at low altitude in darkness. The pilots, navigated by a combination of instruments, GPS, and dead reckoning, following a carefully planned route that avoided known Libyan positions. Radio communications were kept to an absolute minimum. This was enemy territory, or at least potentially hostile territory, and the goal was to leave no trace, no warning of their presence. As dawn began to break, the Chinooks approached Wadi Doum. The old Libyan airbase looked like a graveyard of military ambition. Destroyed aircraft littered the field. Burned-out buildings testified to the violence of the battle that had taken place there more than a year earlier. The advance team had set up a security perimeter and prepared the landing zone. The Hind sat waiting, stripped down to its essential structure, ready to be lifted. The extraction. The primary Chinook settled into a hover over the Hind. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the moment when months of planning and training would either pay off or fall apart. The pilot had to position the helicopter precisely, keeping it stable in the early morning air while crew members worked below to attach the sling load. The Hind weighed 8 tons, an enormous weight to lift even for a helicopter as powerful as the Chinook. The margin for error was razor thin. Below, the ground crew worked quickly but carefully. The sling itself was a massive set of cables and harnesses designed to distribute the load evenly and prevent the Hind from shifting or spinning during flight. Multiple attachment points had to be secured to the Hind's frame, checked and double-checked. If any single attachment failed during flight, the entire load could become unstable, potentially causing a catastrophic accident. The crew had practiced this countless times in New Mexico, but doing it for real in the Saharan heat, with the knowledge that Libyan forces might discover them at any moment, added a level of pressure that no training exercise could replicate. Finally, the word came up: secure. The sling was attached. The Chinook pilot began to increase collective, adding power to lift the load. The helicopter shuddered slightly as it took the weight, 8 tons. The engine strained, rotor blades biting into the thin desert air. Slowly, carefully, the Hind lifted off the ground, dangling beneath the Chinook like a massive, deadly pendulum. The pilot tested the load, making small adjustments to ensure everything was stable. Any swing or oscillation in the load had to be damped out immediately, or it could build into something uncontrollable. Satisfied that the load was secure and stable, the pilot began to move forward, building speed carefully. The Chinook couldn't fly anywhere near its normal cruising speed while carrying such a heavy external load. The added weight and drag meant slower speeds, higher fuel consumption, and more strain on the engines and transmission. But it was flying, carrying its prize toward safety. The second Chinook had finished loading the smaller components and the last of the advance team. It lifted off and formed up with the primary aircraft. The 2 helicopters turned south, beginning the long flight back to N'Djamena. Behind them, Wadi Dum receded into the distance, one more abandoned outpost in the vast Sahara. But the mission was far from over. They still had to cover 550 miles of hostile territory, refuel twice, and reach N'Djamena before anyone discovered what they'd done. The C-130 Hercules tanker aircraft were waiting at prearranged forward arming and refueling points. These were temporary bases, really just spots in the desert where fuel had been pre-positioned. The Chinooks had to land, shut down, refuel, and take off again, all while exposed and vulnerable. Each refueling stop added time, added risk, added another point where something could go wrong. But there was no choice. Even with the extra fuel tanks, the Chinooks didn't have the range to make the flight in one leg while carrying the Hind. The first refueling stop went smoothly. The helicopters landed, took on fuel, and were back in the air within the planned time frame. The crews were exhausted but focused. They'd been awake for over 24 hours, flying in extreme heat, maintaining constant vigilance. But they were night stalkers, and this was exactly the kind of mission they'd trained for. The second refueling stop, at a place called Musoro, saw temperatures spike even higher, 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and there was precious little shade. The metal surfaces of the helicopters were hot enough that crew members had to wear gloves to avoid burns. The heat affected everything: human performance, engine efficiency, the physical properties of the aircraft themselves. But the refueling was completed, and once again the Chinooks lifted off, now with N'Djamena less than 2 hours away. Wall of sand. They were perhaps an hour from N'Djamena when someone spotted it on the horizon, a wall of sand stretching from ground level to 3,000 feet or higher, a massive sandstorm rolling across the desert like an avalanche in slow motion. Sandstorms in the Sahara can be apocalyptic events, blotting out the sun, reducing visibility to zero, grinding away at anything exposed to the wind-driven sand. Aircraft caught in them can suffer catastrophic damage to engines and avionics. More immediately, flying in zero visibility is an excellent way to fly into the ground. The pilots had no good options. They couldn't go around. The storm was too wide. They couldn't go over. They didn't have the altitude capability, especially not while carrying the Hind. They couldn't turn back. They didn't have the fuel, and turning back would mean abandoning the mission. So they did the only thing they could do. They flew into it, hoping to make it through to the other side before conditions became completely impossible. The wall of sand hit them like a physical force. Visibility dropped to nothing in seconds. The world outside the cockpit windows disappeared into a brown-orange chaos. The pilots were flying entirely on instruments now, trusting their gauges and their training while sand scoured the windscreens and the engines gulped in air filled with fine particles. The night vision goggles were useless, of course. There was nothing to see. Radio communication between the two helicopters became difficult, then impossible, as the storm interfered with their signals. The primary Chinook, carrying the Hind, was flying essentially blind. The slung load created additional problems. The pilots couldn't see it, couldn't tell if it was stable or beginning to swing. They could only feel it through the flight controls, a massive weight below them that had to be kept stable through pilot skill alone. The strain on the crew was immense. They'd been flying for hours in extreme heat, they were exhausted, and now they were trying to fly a heavily loaded helicopter through a sandstorm while essentially blind. The decision was made to land. It was risky. Landing in zero visibility without being able to see the ground was a recipe for a hard landing or worse. But continuing to fly in these conditions was arguably even more dangerous. The pilot began to descend, slowly, carefully, using the radar altimeter to judge distance to the ground. There was no way to tell what the surface was like, whether it was flat or sloped, sandy or rocky. They were setting down blind and hoping for the best. The Chinook touched down, the landing gear sinking slightly into soft sand. The pilot had to react instantly to prevent the helicopter from tilting, keeping it level even as the sand shifted beneath them. It wasn't the smoothest landing in Night Stalker history, but given the circumstances, it was a minor miracle that they were on the ground and intact. The second Chinook landed nearby, its pilot having followed the first aircraft down, using what little instrument guidance they could manage. For 20 minutes, the crews endured what felt like a scene from a disaster movie. The storm raged around them, sand so thick in the air that it was difficult to breathe. The rotor blades still spinning slowly as the helicopters idled on the ground, carved strange patterns in the swirling sand. The noise was tremendous, the howling wind competing with the whine of the turbine engines. No one could see more than a few feet. They were isolated, cut off from support, sitting in the middle of the Sahara in a sandstorm with millions of dollars worth of stolen Soviet technology. But the storm, as violent as it was, passed relatively quickly. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the sand began to thin. Visibility improved from 0 to a few dozen feet to a few hundred feet. The pilots could see each other's aircraft again. They could see the Hind, still securely attached to its sling, coated in a layer of fine sand but otherwise intact. As the visibility continued to improve, the decision was made to lift off and complete the final leg to N'Djamena. They'd come too far to stop now. Mission accomplished. The Chinooks touched down at N'Djamena International Airport in near-zero visibility, the last remnants of the sandstorm still reducing visibility to barely adequate levels. But they were down, they were safe, and they had their prize. The mission had taken 67 hours in country from start to finish. Ground crews immediately began the process of loading the helicopters and the Hind onto C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft. Actually, 2 C-5s were needed, one for the Hind and various components, another for the Chinooks themselves. The loading had to be done quickly. Every hour they remained in Chad was another hour for something to go wrong, for the Libyans to discover what had happened, for political complications to arise. By late on June 11th, both C-5s were loaded and ready. They took off in sequence, climbing into the African sky and turning west toward the Atlantic. The route home would take them across Africa, over the Atlantic, and eventually to the United States. The crews could finally relax, at least somewhat. The most dangerous part was over. They'd pulled off a mission that many had thought was impossible, or at least inadvisable. They'd stolen one of the Soviet Union's most advanced helicopters right out from under the noses of Gaddafi's forces, and they'd done it without firing a shot, without losing anyone, without even being detected until long after they were gone. The Mi-25 arrived at Fort Rucker, Alabama on June 16, 1988. Fort Rucker was home to the United States Army Aviation Center, the place where Army pilots were trained and where aviation doctrine was developed. It was the perfect location to study the Hind. Over the following months and years, American engineers and pilots took the helicopter apart and put it back together again, studying every aspect of its design. They brought it up to flying status and tested it extensively, comparing its performance to American helicopters. They examined its armor, its engines, its weapon systems, its avionics. What they learned was valuable for multiple reasons. First, it gave American designers specific data about Soviet engineering approaches, which could inform the development of American systems. Second, it allowed American forces to develop much more effective tactics for fighting against Hinds, should a conflict with Soviet forces or Soviet-equipped armies ever occur. Third, it provided a baseline for training. The Hind was eventually used in exercises as an opposing force, giving American pilots and ground forces realistic training against a real Soviet aircraft rather than trying to simulate one. The helicopter served for years in this role, flying as part of the Threat Systems Management Office, demonstrating Soviet capabilities to units across the military. It appeared in training exercises where it played the role of enemy aircraft, giving American forces invaluable experience. Pilots who had only seen Hinds on intelligence briefing slides could now see one in person, fly against it, learn its capabilities and limitations firsthand. Legacy in the museum. Eventually, like all aircraft, the Mi-25's operational life came to an end. By 2012, it had been in American hands for nearly a quarter century. It had served its purpose admirably, providing intelligence, training, and insight into Soviet military aviation. But it was no longer needed for active use. Plans were made to scrap it, to cut it up for spare parts, or simply dispose of it as military surplus. That's when the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama stepped in. The museum recognized the historical significance of this particular aircraft. This wasn't just any Mi-25 Hind. This was the helicopter that had been the objective of one of the Cold War's most daring covert operations. It represented a unique moment in history when American Special Operations Forces had pulled off an impossible heist in the Sahara Desert. In 2012, the museum received the aircraft, saving it from the scrapyard and putting it on display where the public could see it and learn its story. Today, you can visit the Southern Museum of Flight and see the Hind sitting there, a silent testament to an extraordinary mission. The museum has preserved it well, maintaining it as close to its original condition as possible. Visitors can walk around it, see the size of it, get a sense of why it was such a formidable machine. Information plaques tell the story of Operation Mount Hope 3, though probably not in as much detail as what you've just heard. The helicopter that once struck fear into the hearts of Afghan mujahideen, that represented the pinnacle of Soviet attack helicopter design, now sits peacefully in Alabama, a relic of a conflict that ended not with a bang, but with the quiet dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. The story of Operation Mount Hope 3 offers lessons that remain relevant even today. It demonstrates the value of specialized units like the Night Stalkers, forces that can pull off missions conventional units couldn't attempt. It shows the importance of intelligence gathering and the lengths nations will go to understand their adversaries' capabilities. It illustrates how even in times of détente and improving relations, the fundamental competitions and suspicions of international relations continue beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties. It also reminds us of the strange twists of history. The Toyota War, with its pickup trucks defeating Soviet tanks in the African desert, seems almost surreal. The idea of stealing an entire helicopter under circumstances that wouldn't be out of place in an action movie seems equally improbable. Yet it all happened, meticulously planned and executed by some of the most skilled aviation personnel in the world. The Cold War produced many such stories, operations that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible, all in service of the endless competition for advantage between superpowers. For the Night Stalkers, Operation Mount Hope 3 added another entry to their growing legend. It demonstrated their capabilities in an environment far different from the jungles and mountains they had operated in before. The mission validated their training, their equipment, and their approach to special operations aviation. The lessons learned in the Sahara would be applied in countless other missions in the years to come, from Panama to the Persian Gulf, from Somalia to Afghanistan and Iraq. The motto, "Night Stalkers Don't Quit," was proven once again in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. And for anyone interested in military history, in special operations, or in the hidden stories of the Cold War, the Hind sitting in that museum in Alabama represents something more than just a helicopter. It's a physical link to a time when the world was divided into two competing systems, when every advantage mattered, when brave men and women risked their lives for missions that the public wouldn't learn about for years or even decades. It's a reminder that history is written not just by politicians and generals, but by the pilots and soldiers who execute the impossible missions that everyone else thinks can't be done. The next time you hear a helicopter passing overhead, particularly at night, think about the Night Stalkers and missions like Operation Mount Hope 3. Someone, somewhere, is training for the next impossible mission. Someone is pushing the limits of what rotary wing aircraft can do. Someone is planning the next operation that future historians will write about with the same sense of amazement that we now feel when we hear about stealing a helicopter from the Sahara Desert during the last gasps of the Cold War. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Cold War's most audacious operations, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below if you want to hear about other secret military operations or if you have questions about Operation Mount Hope 3. There are so many more incredible stories from this era waiting to be told, stories of bravery, ingenuity, and the endless competition for advantage that defined the second half of the 20th century. Until next time, keep exploring history's hidden corners. The truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction, and in the case of the Night Stalkers stealing a Soviet helicopter from the middle of the Sahara, it's definitely more incredible than anything Hollywood could dream up.